In 1973, 120 members of the Vanderbilt family gathered for a reunion at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. They were the direct descendants of the man who, a century prior, stood as the wealthiest human being on the surface of the planet. As they looked around that room, a chilling reality set in. Among the 120 heirs of the world's first $200 billion dynasty, not a single one of them was a millionaire. By 1885, the Vanderbilt family fortune had grown to over $200 million. That's equal to roughly $7 billion today when adjusted for inflation. But inflation doesn't capture their true power. At their peak, the Vanderbilts controlled over 4,500 miles of railroad track connecting America's most important cities, including New York, Boston, and Chicago. These railroads weren't just transportation, they were the backbone of the entire economy. Almost everything, food, oil, steel, raw materials, moved along Vanderbilt-controlled rail lines. Businesses depended on them. Cities grew because of them. Every time goods moved across America, the Vanderbilts profited. Because of this control, their fortune wasn't just billions in today's money. It represented economic power equivalent to nearly $200 billion today. They didn't just have wealth, they controlled the flow of the American economy itself. How does a fortune that once exceeded the entire US Treasury simply vanish? This is not just a story of spending, it is a story of a social war, of architectural madness, and the forgotten lesson of the iron that built the gold. Welcome to the anatomy of a disappearing empire. Every empire has a predator at its origin. For the Vanderbilts, it was Cornelius the Commodore. He was a man of the 18th century, uneducated and unrefined, who viewed the world as a series of obstacles to be crushed. In 1810, he didn't just borrow $100 to buy a barge, he made a pact with the sea. While the gentlemen of New York's shipping elite traded in fine tea and silk, Cornelius traded in raw survival, undercutting rivals until they were bankrupt, then buying their wreckage for pennies. By the 1860s, the Commodore had moved from water to iron, but he met his match in the infamous Erie War. His rivals, the robber barons Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, illegally watered the Erie Railroad stock, literally printing 50,000 fake certificates to dilute Vanderbilt's shares. They stole $7 million from him in a single night, nearly $200 million in today's currency. Vanderbilt didn't look to the courts for justice, he looked for a throat to squeeze. He famously warned them, "I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you." His retaliation remains the most ruthless move in American corporate history. Vanderbilt owned the only bridge into Manhattan. In the dead of winter, he simply locked it. He cut off the heart of New York from the rest of the nation's trade, causing the Erie stock to collapse into worthlessness. When the dust settled, the Commodore didn't just own the rails, he owned the city's pulse. By his death in 1877, he had amassed $105 million. To put that in perspective, his personal net worth was equivalent to $1 out of every $87 in the entire US GDP. But the Commodore left behind a warning that was more curse than counsel. He left almost everything to his son, William Henry Billy Vanderbilt, telling him, "Any fool can make a fortune. It takes a man of brains to hold it." Billy was not a predator like his father, he was a caretaker. In just 8 years, through a series of tactical railroad expansions, he doubled the family fortune to over $200 million. He was, for a time, the richest human being on the planet. Yet, Billy lived in a state of constant, paralyzing anxiety. He realized the fatal flaw of the Gilded Age, that the more you have, the more the world wants to take from you. He was hounded by the press, sued by his siblings, and burdened by a fortune that he claimed made him feel like a slave. When he died suddenly of a stroke in 1885, he was worth $5 billion modern dollars. But the stewardship died with him. He left the money to his sons, but he couldn't leave them his hunger. The iron generation was gone. The age of the gold spenders had arrived. By the 1880s, the Vanderbilt bank accounts were full, but their social ledgers remained empty. In the rigid hierarchy of New York's Knickerbocker elite, money was considered a vulgarity if it hadn't been aged for at least 3 generations. The city was ruled by the iron whim of Mrs. Caroline Astor and her 400, a list of families whose lineage was supposedly as pure as their white gloves. To them, the Vanderbilts were the railroad people, noisy, intrusive, and hopelessly new money. But Alva Vanderbilt was not a woman to be ignored. She understood that if the front door of society was locked, she would simply build a more magnificent door. She commissioned the legendary architect Richard Morris Hunt to build 665th Avenue, a white limestone French Renaissance chateau that stood as a deliberate provocation to the modest brownstones of the old guard. It was the first chateau-esque building in New York, a $3 million fortress designed for a single purpose: social conquest. Her masterstroke was the fancy dress ball of March 26, 1883. It was a night of tactical decadence that cost an estimated $250,000, over $6 million today. 1,200 invitations were sent out, but Alva pointedly excluded Mrs. Astor's daughter, claiming she couldn't invite someone she hadn't formally met. To save her daughter's social life, the Queen of New York was forced to climb into her carriage, drive to the Vanderbilt mansion, and leave her calling card. The siege was over. The Vanderbilts had won. The night was a fever dream of excess. Alice Vanderbilt appeared as the Electric Light, wearing a gown of gold and silver tinsel created by the House of Worth in Paris. Hidden beneath the fabric were batteries that powered a torch she held aloft, a technological miracle that made her literally glow in the dark ballroom. It was a metaphor for the family's new, undeniable power. By dawn, the Vanderbilt name was no longer a vulgarity. It was the new standard. But the price of this acceptance was paid in the happiness of the next generation. Alva required a royal title to cement the family's pedigree, and she used her daughter, Consuelo, as the ultimate currency. In 1895, she forced Consuelo into a loveless marriage with the Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo was traded for a $2.5 million dowry in railroad stock, roughly $75 million today, which the Duke immediately used to repair his crumbling Blenheim Palace in England. On her wedding morning, Consuelo's eyes were so red from weeping that she had to hide behind a heavy veil. The Vanderbilts were no longer a family. They had become a global corporation trading in prestige. They had achieved the pinnacle of the social world, but they had forgotten the Commodore's most vital lesson: that a foundation built on the vanity of others is a foundation built on sand. By the 1890s, the Vanderbilts were no longer competing for business, they were competing for history. In Newport, Cornelius Vanderbilt II commissioned the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace that cost over $7 million in 1895, roughly $220 million today. It was built in just 2 years with a single goal: to make the European royalty who visited feel underprivileged. But even this was eclipsed by George Vanderbilt's obsession in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Biltmore was a 175,000 square foot chateau that didn't just break records, it broke the logic of wealth. With 250 rooms and 65 fireplaces, it was a black hole for capital. George acquired 125,000 acres of land to ensure his view would never be interrupted by the common man. These were not homes, they were feudal monuments. Biltmore required an army of over 400 staff to function, an invisible fleet of maids moving through secret corridors. The annual maintenance cost would be over $5 million today. Before a single guest was served a glass of champagne, the house had already consumed a fortune. While the family was building marble halls, the financial landscape of America was shifting. In 1913, the 16th Amendment introduced the federal income tax. For decades, the Vanderbilt fortune had grown in a tax-free vacuum. Now, the math of the Gilded Age was being rewritten by the government. The Commodore had paid 0%. His grandsons were suddenly facing a world where up to 70% of their top-tier income could be reclaimed by the state. This was followed by the Revenue Act of 1916, introducing the estate tax. For the Vanderbilts, death was no longer just a tragedy, it was a massive liquidation event. Yet they refused to adjust. The yachts grew larger, the parties grew louder. They were no longer the masters of their fortune, they were the prisoners of their own standard. A standard that required a $200 billion empire just to stand still. By 1947, the war was not just over. The battlefield had been erased. The legendary Petit Chateau at 665th Avenue was sold for the price of the vacant land beneath it. The liquidation was a fire sale of history. Italian marble mantles that cost $50,000 were sold for $500. The family's legendary 52-carat Vanderbilt diamond was sold just to cover mounting back taxes. The world no longer had room for the Vanderbilt lifestyle, but the true bankruptcy was moral. In 1934, the public sat captivated by the trial of the century, the custody battle over Little Gloria Vanderbilt. It was a $5 million war between a mother and an aunt that dragged the family name through the mud of tabloid gossip. The testimony was a spectacle of filth. A French maid testified to neglect and decadence. The trial proved a haunting truth. The Vanderbilt name had become a burden, a gilded weight that crushed those who carried it. Today, Anderson Cooper, the great-great-great-grandson of the Commodore, stands as the most visible face of the lineage. He built his own career from the ground up, famously stating that his mother assured him there was no trust fund. He calls inherited money an initiative sucker, a curse that robs an heir of the hunger required to build. In 1973, at that final reunion, the heirs didn't just share a name, they shared the realization that while they had the blood of the Commodore, they had lost the iron of his spirit. The Vanderbilt story is a mirror. It shows us that true power is not found in what we build, but in what we preserve. The Commodore built with iron so his sons could build with gold, but because they never learned the value of the iron, the gold eventually returned to the earth. Legacy is not a gift, it is a discipline. It is the unyielding standard one sets when no one is watching. As we look back at the ruins of Fifth Avenue, we must ask, are we building for the season or for the century? If you value the preservation of history, welcome to the circle. This has been The Gilded Standard. Discretion is everything.